We acknowledge that Tri-Cities Community Television operates on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coquitlam First Nation. We thank the Coquitlam who continue to live on these lands and care for them along with the waters and all that is above and below.
Do you remember on the 9th of June when it came on the radio? Maybe you saw the headline, maybe you still don't know. It said 3 cons have taken 15 hostages, they're holding them down with a knife. 3 men are betting on freedom, betting the rest of their life. Do you remember a woman named Mary? She was held on the edge of a blade. She never died from no knife at her throat. She died for the friends she made.
Hello, my name is Margaret Franz. In honor of the 50th anniversary of my sister Mary Steinhauser's tragic death on June the 11th, 1975, at the British Columbia Penitentiary in New Westminster, BC, I produced and directed this panel presentation you're about to watch on the themes of mental health and prison justice in the province of British Columbia in Canada. But who was Mary Steinhauser, and how is her work related to mental health and prison justice in BC? At the time of her death, at 32 years of age, Mary was employed as a social worker at the BC Penitentiary. Here, at this aging and notorious maximum security prison in Western Canada, Mary's caseload consisted of 60 prison inmates, whose sentences were 2 years plus a day. In her daily work with prison inmates, Mary acted on her beliefs that no one was without hope of redemption and transformation into a new life. Mary was a warrior for justice. She was a beacon of light inside the prison walls, and she was a martyr for the cause she believed in. The body of my project consists of the voices and experiences of knowledgeable subject matter experts on the aforementioned themes of mental health and prison justice in British Columbia, Canada. Not only are these speakers considered learned experts in their fields, they, like Mary, are also intensely committed to the search for truth in their areas of expertise. They are Dr. John Higinbottam, Irene Petterson, and Ken Petterson. As you will discover, each of their presentations is both a history lesson and an object lesson in the themes and issues that dominate our news cycle in British Columbia and across Canada today. As the forlorn and haunting images of the tortured, lost souls wandering our downtown streets populate our digital and television screens, we recognize the addicted, the homeless, or both. But sadly, we sigh and look away. Why? Because we feel helpless to do anything that will change their agonizing reality. We can and ought to do better for those who live and die on our city's mean streets. I hope that this film may spur you to do something meaningful and positive to change their reality, and at the same time to repair our shameful neglect of the most impoverished and needy in our society. They deserve our compassion and our determination to right this terrible wrong. Thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure to welcome you today to In Mary's Footsteps, a commemorative event honoring the late Mary Steinhauser's life and work. I'm Margaret Franz, for those of you who don't know. Mary's sister, and I'm delighted to be here today to be your host on this very special occasion. And now on to our esteemed panelists and speakers for today. Dr. John Higinbottam. John is a renowned neuropsychologist who for most of his career has held senior positions in mental health care, including that of Vice President of the Vancouver Hospital, Vice President of Riverview Hospital, and Vice President of BC Rehab. John is also a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry at UBC. The third panelist in this is the highly respected founder of the Irene V. Petterson Counseling Services of Abbotsford, BC. Irene Petterson herself, who is a registered psychiatric nurse, a social worker, a clinical counselor, and longtime friend and colleagues of Mary's. The fourth panelist is Ken Petterson, who is one of a couple along with Irene. They've been married for quite a long time. Now, Ken has an extremely interesting resume. He was the formerly assistant warden at the BC Penitentiary in 1975, and the acting warden and the deputy warden at Kent Institution, which is the maximum security facility opened in 1979 to replace the BC Penitentiary. He was also the acting warden at the Mission Medium Security Institution. Ken is currently serving in his retirement years, retirement in quotes. In his retirement years, he is serving on the boards of the Clayburn Village Society, the Abbotsford Restorative Justice Society, and is also on the Senate for the Coquitlam Healing Village, which is a federal healing village in the Fraser Valley. Can would you stand up, please, and tell people, show people who you are, or turn around?
Turn around.
Can we just maybe clap for all these women? Thank you. I thought to myself, what a treasure trove of community wisdom is present here. Now, the purpose of my event in Mary's Footsteps is to honor my late sister's sacrifice by opening up a conversation about the two most important interests that infused and dominated Mary's professional life. That was mental health and prison justice in the province of BC. This event is a platform for our 4 renowned subject matter experts in these fields to share with us their wealth of knowledge and experience about these 2 themes. We're here to learn and be inspired by their words, and we hope that each of you will find this experience enriching and fulfilling. In conclusion, I want to thank you all once again for being here. Your presence and participation are what will make In Mary's Footsteps a resounding success. Thank you. And now, just as an intro, I would like to say a few words about Mary. About Mary. Well, what about Mary? As my older sister and my only sibling, Mary Elizabeth Steinhauser has been a constant presence and inspiration in my life. Even after she died so tragically at 32, in the prime of her life, Mary continues to occupy a part of my soul where she now rests in quiet repose. When this year, 2025, rolled around, it was the 50th anniversary of her death in June 1975. So it seemed an ideal month to publicly honor her brave sacrifice and breathe life once again into her public persona. But how best to honor Mary, I asked myself. I considered the interests that guided Mary in her choice of professions. She was both a psychiatric nurse and a social worker. So it seemed that mental health and well-being, followed by social justice, were obviously driving forces. For the first 4 years of her working life, Mary's focus was psychiatric nursing. Her employment included positions at Riverview, Espondale Mental Hospital at Coquitlam, BC, Queen Street Mental Health Centre in Toronto, Ontario, Tranquille School for the development of delayed in Kamloops, BC, and finally, in 1966, Mary accepted a position at Matsqui Institution, the then brand new and very first federal drug dependency treatment facility for male prison inmates only. This assignment would guide the agenda for the next stage of Mary's life. What Mary learned in the challenging position would broaden her understanding of the relationship between mental health and criminality. For this, she would need additional education to truly appreciate the unique requirements of this now reality she worked within. As a result, Mary quickly signed up at SFU, Simon Fraser University, to earn her honors BA degree in psychology and sociology. But she didn't stop there. And within months of getting her BA, she applied to the University of British Columbia to begin working on her Master of Social Work degree. 2 years later, at the graduation ceremony, Mary donned her regalia and posed, smiling proudly, for her graduation picture. She was a full-fledged social worker. So, her first job, after she got that wonderful master's degree and complete with her cap and gown, she had to find a job. And the first place that she applied for was at the BC Penitentiary in New Westminster. And it was for male only, who had sentences of a year plus a day. On Mary's caseload were 60 inmates, each with a unique set of problems and histories. Refusing to be daunted by the life challenges in front of her, Mary rose to the occasion and became, and I quote, a beacon of light inside the prison, a modern-day Joan of Arc, and someone, quote, who helped many inmates when others had given up on them as hopeless cases. Driving home the enormity of Mary's final sacrifice upon learning of her death, in a prisoner escape attempt and hostage taking at the BC Penitentiary on June 9th to the 11th, 1975, the Prime Minister of Canada, the then Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, declared that Mary set, and I quote again, an example for all Canadians. Furthermore, in his homily at Mary's funeral, the Reverend J.A. Nichols, Chaplain General of the Correctional Services Canada, declared, "The New Testament answers that the finest life ended on the cross. Such was the life of Mary Steinhauser, who served life faithfully and gave so much to our service." And that's the end of my address.
I'm going to be focusing really on the question I have been asked for the last 20 years or so. And everywhere I go in the province, every clinician I talk to, anybody who knows anything about mental health, plus the families and the people who actually have had encounters with serious mental illness, they keep asking the same question: why the hell did they close that place? And I've done consulting work all over the province, and you keep getting the same question asked. Why? How did that happen? And it really kind of fits with what Anna was just saying about unfortunately, the last few years of Riverview's existence. Very, very sad story. So I'm going to be focused, you get your Kleenex out, I'm going to be focusing on the sad story of what happened to Riverview, basically. So I put this up here not to, you already provided my background, but I just wanted to give you some of my perspective, which is really, I think you'll get this perspective as I go through the presentation. So it's true, I've spent most of my life working in mental health services, and most of that has been in senior leadership positions. I ended up working as responsible for mental health psychiatry at Vancouver General. And the reason I'm telling you all this is it's going to fit with some of what I say later on, and it'll explain some of my comments. I also had the wonderful experience of being an accreditation surveyor for the Canadian Council of Health Services Accreditation, now Accreditation Canada. I did that for 15 years, and I surveyed, I think, almost every single mental health, brain injury, and continuing care program in Canada. Some places like Alberta, I think I did Calgary about 3 or 4 times, and had went to most of the provincial psychiatric hospitals. And so I had the opportunity really to see how mental health systems were working right through province to province to province. And that's going to color some of my remarks as well. Later on, I went more into advocacy, and I did some work with the Mental Health Commission of Canada, again on mental health systems. And then I was also co-chair for CAMI, which is the Canadian Alliance of Mental Illness Mental Health. This is an umbrella group which was really all the major advocacy organizations like the Schizophrenia Society of Canada, the Mental Health, the Mood Disorders Association of Canada, Canadian Psychiatric, Canadian Psychological, OTs, social workers, you name it. And we had quite a bit of clout and had the ability to have meetings with the Prime Minister and people in Ottawa and try and talk some sense into them. So that's really my background. As I mentioned, this is going to explain some of my comments. The early history, this has already been really covered by Anna very nicely. There's a picture, I think, of Center Line. Here's a lovely aerial view of the hospital complex. Just give the reason this is in here is just to give you an idea of what a huge public asset this is. And I say it's a public asset. This belongs to the people of BC, and you would never know this from the behavior of some of the politicians and so on. But this is a public asset, and it's certainly not being used to the best advantage of the people of BC by any means. And that's another story we'll get into a little bit. Again, some of the buildings: Greece, West Lawn, Center Lawn, North Lawn. It was, as it evolved, as Anna described, it became a small town, and actually had its own railway station. It had its own post office. It had its own fire hall down on the right. There is the fire hall. And this is a site map, and it's actually less territory depicted in that map compared to what the original was. To the back was a whole area that was hived off and given for development, and that's where Choco and all those streets are up there now. Again, a site map. Just for people who are interested, at the front, the black building is actually the former Crease Clinic. And then at the very back, at the top of the map is North Lawn. And then the three buildings in the middle are West Lawn, Center Lawn, and East Lawn. The main buildings, which Anna already discussed. And then over on the far right, there was Valley View, which was the psychogeriatric program. And this is something else that has almost never been mentioned, but needs to be talked about. Not only did Riverview have a very specialized capability, what we call tertiary capability, because it did things which couldn't be done in the acute care hospitals, including VGH and PAU and St. Paul's and so on. But it also had a very specialized psychogeriatric capability. And by that, we would get patients admitted, and some of you might know this. They would come in. They were in a toxic state. They were being prescribed what we call polypharmacy. They had so many drugs prescribed. You'd ask their relatives to go and bring in their drugs, and they'd bring a couple of shopping bags full of drugs, and they'd have to be detoxed basically so you could work with them. And that was a very specialized capability that Valley View had, which again was lost when they closed Riverview. It's something that's not really talked about. I'm surprised it hasn't hit the press actually. Okay, so here's the early history once again, and just recap. It kept growing in size until 1955. The peak population was about 5,500, so it was a very sizable enterprise at that time. It was a small town, one railway station, and it, as it was mentioned, actually received, and I think it was 1952, correct? It got the gold medal of the American Psychiatric Association for the excellence of programs. So I'll just go over this fairly quickly. In 1965, Estendale was renamed Riverview Hospital, and the site again was shared with Valley View, which was the provincial psychogeriatric service at the time. The first very significant date, Community Mental Health Center opened in Kelowna in 1974. And there were a couple of really critical times where Riverview actually was providing the leadership for the whole mental health services in the province. And 1974 was one of them because Dr. Frank McNair, one of the Riverview psychiatrists, went to Kelowna and he opened up the first community mental health center in the province in Kelowna. And so that was a Riverview initiative. And I'll tell you about a couple more as we get into it. So Riverview did actually lead in being innovative and introducing some new clinical programs and initiatives. That first mental health center that opened in 1974 marked a turning point, and after that, the government policy, which was a good one, was to try and develop capability within the communities of the province to provide secondary psychiatric services, secondary mental health services. We're talking about what the general hospitals should be doing. And before that time, if somebody had a mental illness, they came to Riverview. There's no other choice. After the policy of developing the community acute care units in places like VGH, Ridge Meadows, you name it, any sizable community after a while had an acute care unit. And there was also a network of mental health centers developed throughout the province, which were supposed to provide storefront services. So if you had a relative, or it was you needed some immediate intervention because of your mental illness, you could just walk into the mental health center and they were going to provide you with care and perhaps refer you onto the hospital if you needed that level of care. Just try that these days and see what happens. Take one well, if you can find one that's open. Just don't try it on a Friday afternoon, by the way. So that's another concept that should have been much better than it really turned out to be. Okay, in '87, as was mentioned, Riverview was placed under its own board, BC Mental Health Society, and with a succession of administrators. I want to emphasize there was a succession there because they didn't last very long. The one guy who actually I developed a good relationship, working relationship with, and I won't mention his name, but he was brought out of St. Thomas, Ontario, because he was described as the meanest SOB anybody ever knew. And that was the beginning of the agenda that they were really going to try and start closing the place. They weren't talking about closing it just at that time, but that was sort of the hidden agenda. It was already being talked about then. So on one hand, they were putting it under its own board, calling it the BC Mental Health Services, and on the other hand, they were kind of in the background and taking steps really to try and shut it down. And I was around in these days, and it was Ann and I were talking about it a bit earlier. We remembered the days when they came in with plan after plan after plan for the future of Riverview. And they all talked about, initially called it the Riverview Replacement Program. And it actually got to the point where they appointed an architect who was a great guy. He came over and spent lots of time with him. He did a functional program on the site, and he came in with a vision for a new psychiatric hospital. It was going to be based on North Lawn, come down the hill there. And it was going to be state-of-the-art architecture for a specialized 358 to 400 bed tertiary psychiatric hospital. I don't want to get too technical here, but let me just explain for those of you who might not know how the system is organized. It's organized in terms of primary care, secondary, and tertiary. Primary is your family doctor, or if you go into a community, into a care clinic in the community. Secondary is general hospital, basically, like PAU, Ridge Meadows, Surrey Memorial, etc., with an acute care psychiatric unit. Tertiary is specialized. Tertiary means that it has a capability that the general hospitals don't have. Okay, and I can say this again because I was responsible for services at VGH, okay, which is, the biggest hospital in Western Canada and most specialized, and it did not have a true tertiary capability. We had patients backed up there when I was responsible for it that we were holding because we needed to transfer them to Riverview. Riverview had a specialized capability, and it unfortunately was lost when Riverview was closed. So I'm going to say more about that. 1998, yet another mental health plan. This time, Riverview would have a significant role for the foreseeable future, but the hospital was to be closed within 7 years. So it's like listening to Donald Trump. It's this kind of double talk. And we actually had an incident where that beautiful recreation hall that Anna showed the photo of Pennington Hall. All the staff were assembled to go into Pennington Hall. Everybody was in there for a rah-rah speech by the then assistant deputy minister. So this guy comes over from Victoria, and everybody's sitting, all the staff are sitting in Pennington Hall. And he says, "We're going to close that place in 3 years." So it had moved from 7 years up to 3 years. completely killed the morale in the hospital. Tried to hire staff after that. We had some of the finest doctors, finest psychiatrists, finest psychologists, staff and nurses in the province, in Canada. And we had that specialized tertiary capability, and it was just like putting a pin in a balloon. It was devastating to the morale in the hospital, and it was, after that, we just had a terrible time hiring and retaining staff, except for these darn administrators kept popping up. So this recommendation, the 98, the one that was closer to 7 years, was really met with very strong opposition by Coquitlam. Here, Stuart knows the history on this, certainly, and the people in Coquitlam, and the public in general. There was really outrage. So why did it close? What's some of the background to that? What was the thinking? What caused this? Well, in the 1950s, as was mentioned, Riverview, like most of the provincial hospitals, was overcrowded, and then in the 50s, things started to change, and there were drugs like chlorpromazine, and so gradually you saw the populations of psychiatric hospitals slowing down, and the population started dropping. When I was at Riverview, I started there in 1980, and there were 1,400 patients there. So between the time it had peaked in 1955 and 1980, when there was about 4,100 patients had actually been discharged to the community. To a large extent, this was not because of the drugs, because the drugs still aren't that great. It was because they developed the community psychiatric units, BGH, et cetera, the secondary ones, and they'd also developed the community services, community programs, outreach services, and so on. So, beginning in the 1960s, as the treatment ideology in North America switched from long-term asylum care to community-based treatment, but that really paralleled the development of community capability. If you don't, sort of the basic message here, which the bureaucrats never seem to understand in Victoria, is you can't push people out of psychiatric hospitals by cutting their budgets and doing things like that, and ordering that you're going to have to discharge N number of patients to the community. You have to pull them out of the hospitals by having a community capability so that they can come out of hospitals. And I talk about housing, community care, et cetera, et cetera. So the deinstitutionalization movement peaked in the 70s and 80s, and by 1980, many of the psychiatric hospitals in Canada, the provincial ones, the tertiary ones, and state hospitals in the U.S. were either dramatically downsized or closed. So in BC, this resulted in, again, in major policy changes. And again, people would only be directly admitted to the acute care units. It only referred to Riverview if more specialized longer-term treatment was required. Up to that point, you could take yourself or your relative to Riverview and get a direct admission. In fact, when I worked there, I can remember the RCMP bringing patients to Riverview to the front door, and in they came. Okay, how was this sold to the government of BC? And again, I don't want to point too many fingers at the government itself. The problem was more with the bureaucracy, actually, we were dealing with. So in BC, deinstitutionalization was sold with commitments to develop adequate community mental health housing and support programs with promises. The acute care psychiatric units would replace Riverview at much lower cost. New patients wouldn't require medium and longer term treatment. Long-term patients would have better lives in community group homes where they could be housed and supported at much lower cost. And the best way, this was the government thinking, the best way to downsize and hopefully close Riverview would be to cut its budget and give it yearly quotas of patients to be discharged to the community. And so it was kind of the death of 100 cuts. And I remember those days, we'd suddenly be told, you've got to cut your budget by 20% and move 100 patients or 200 patients out to the community. Well, there's no place for them. It doesn't matter, get them out there. And the hidden agenda, I think, was clearly closing Riverview. Was going to save all sorts of money. Well, actually, Riverview didn't have a huge budget. When I was working there back in the early 80s, it was about $100 million a year, which is a drop in the bucket by today's standards. So, what happened? While other provinces embraced deinstitutionalization, particularly Ontario and Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan was really the leader. They had 4 or 5 psych hospitals, and they closed them all except for North Battleford. It was soon recognized that deinstitutionalization was not living up to the high hopes of its advocates. Soon the media were full of horror stories of the unintended consequences of deinstitutionalization, with many former patients becoming homeless, sleeping on park benches, becoming public nuisances. This really seemed to have a big impact on Ontario first. They closed Lakeshore Psychiatric, I remember, and the patients there were sleeping on the park benches in Toronto, and the public were just outraged by this. Not that the people in the park benches about it in particular, but that the government would do this. Police became street front psychiatrists with a huge increase of apprehensions under the Mental Health Act. However, the acute care psychiatric units did not have the capability. This is a really key point that was never understood by the BC government, especially the bureaucracy. The acute care psychiatric units did not have the capability to treat these former patients. And the mental health centers remained, preferred not to work with them. So this deinstitutionalization became a major political issue. Now, another point I want to make here, this is a fairly important one. Every other province tried deinstitutionalization, and they gave up on it because they recognized the need for this specialized tertiary treatment. Again, you need this specialized tertiary capability, okay? And I can go across the country and tell you what happened. I'll just mention a couple. North Battleford, which was the remaining psych unit tertiary unit in Saskatchewan, was redeveloped. They got a brand new hospital there now. It's a couple of years old, including a forensic unit. And Ontario built a brand new hospital, Ontario Shores in Whitby. The old 999 Queen Street, where Mary worked, became CAMH, Center for Addiction and Mental Health, which is probably the premier program in Canada. And this has happened even in provinces like Manitoba. They had 2 there. They had Selkirk and they had Brandon. They closed Brandon, kept Selkirk going because they needed it. Alberta were smart enough to hang on to 3 of their tertiary units. They had Edmonton, Panoka, and Claresholm. I won't go on, but what's really been frustrating is the fact that BC thinks it's on the cutting edge, and really they're behind the curve. And intelligent behavior is realizing you need to change your behavior because of what's experience of what's happening. What's been the aftermath of closing Riverview? I don't want to say too much about this because it's all around us. Many discharged former Riverview patients required community services. They didn't get them. They went out with minimum per diem rates. I think they were paying $53 a day when we were ordered to send them out. And a person with developmental disability going out from Woodlands, when they closed the Woodlands, they were paying up to $400 a day per diem rates. So the people with mental illness really got shortchanged. They were not, as Anna mentioned, they were not supported in group homes for the most part, and their quality of life was much worse than Riverview. And I'm really talking here about the longer-term people who could live in the community, who were not receiving really active psychiatric treatment. Their needs were more residential, and that was great that they went to the community if they had been provided with proper resources. But they still didn't deal with the tertiary problem. So the failure to provide sufficient housing has been identified as a major reason for Vancouver's continuing mental health crisis, with a major increase in police contacts, psychiatric emergency units, and involved in serious mental health. Street people, many people with street people, of course, are victims of the toxic drug crisis. Many of them, in fact, most of them have serious mental illness as well. Most of them actually have histories of brain injury as well. So finally, and this is good news, and I'll say a bit more about it in a couple of minutes, the government has finally, light has come on, and they've gotten away from diagnoses with these people, saying, you're a drug addict, this is a mental health unit, you go to down the street to the addictions program. Go down the street to the addictions program and you say, oh, but you got a mental illness. So the bottom line is that people didn't get services at all. So the province did create what they call tertiary programs, but they weren't tertiary compared to what I've been talking about here. The programs that had the capability that didn't exist at Riverview. They've got the Redfish program on the Riverview site now. It is actually a tertiary program, but it's got a very small capacity. And it was actually just created using beds, so they moved over from Riverview site. So it's a bit of a smoke and mirrors situation. So there's been a steady increase in emergency admissions, including mental health apprehensions, public disorder, homelessness, violence, etc. And it's now become a major public and political issue in BC. It always brought down the government. So I don't want to get into this too much, but since 2012, there have been many calls to reopen Riverview, which is including 2013 Union of BC Municipalities resolution to reinstate it. 2014, Coquitlam had a proposal to provide services back on Riverview site, which would have been wonderful. But 2024, mayors of Vancouver, Port Coquitlam, and Nanaimo have all gone. Other mayors as well have gone public on this issue. Prince George, Dr. Kane, recently Barb Kane, a psychiatrist in Prince George, has gone public and pushed for reopening Riverview or creating another Riverview up in this Prince George area. Newbie Society over here in Poco, they've been pushing for it, and the BC Conservative Party, so it's got a political push here in BC as well. And then are the dissenting voices. CMHA, well, that's not really the answer. We're not sure about that one. The media coverage has been terrible. If you look particularly if you look online, you'll see websites on there with Riverview ghost stories, the eerie past of Riverview, the horrible past of Riverview, and all this is what really gets me the angriest. Is the fact this recreation of history. Because I've worked with those staff, and I've done accreditation surveys across Canada. Riverview had the most caring, supportive environment you could ask for. The accountability was sky high in there. If one patient ever got abused, that staff member would have been fired on the spot. I know because there was very strict accountability compared to what happens in the community most of the time. And so it's very distorted, unfounded, negative publicity in social media and elsewhere. I just think it's so unfair and tarnish the history of the reputation of the people who work there. So okay, getting to the end here. So BC's mental health substance use crisis has peaked with the current toxic drug crisis. It's become the major health and political issue in the province. The crisis is devastating individuals, families, and their communities. The one bit of good news, is Dr. Daniel Vigo, a colleague of mine in UBC Psychiatry, has being appointed. I think the Premier, to his great credit, completely lost faith in the bureaucracy around mental health in Victoria, and they actually disbanded the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions there. And he appointed Dr. Vigo, who's a smart guy. He's actually worked in the field. He was at Burnaby Psych for years. He knows the stuff, and he's currently rewriting the Mental Health Act. I think you've all heard that he's responsible for setting up some small facilities, which will bring back some of that tertiary capability, But the problem is, with small facilities, I'm speaking as a hospital administrator now, the trouble with small facilities is you don't get economies of scale. So to set up 4 small facilities for 100 beds each or something like that, or fewer, it's going to cost far more proportionately than setting up a central unit. And the other problem you've got is you can't get the clinical talent. Whether you like it or not, one of the things that made Riverview so effective was that it was located here in the Lower Mainland, and so with the UBC connection and so on, and that really is important if you're going to develop a center of excellence. Anyhow, let me just say I think it's a very good step in the right direction. Dr. Vigo's in there right now, and we'll see what happens. So I just one other thing I'll say about him. He did grand rounds in psychiatry about a month ago, and I wish I taped it. I was on a Zoom call, and he said there are three reasons for the current crisis in BC, the toxic drug crisis, mental health crisis. Number 1, closing Riverview. Yeah. Number 1 reason. Number 2, the availability of backyard cheap drugs like fentanyl. You can make it in your garage. And third, also a really important issue, is the fact the siloing of services. The mental health and the addiction services don't work together. Yeah. So, any of you who've tried to access these, you know all about this. So his objectives are, he wants sufficient beds, at least 400. It's got a familiar ring to it. Sufficient community inpatient services, and supports integrated mental health, substance use services and treatments. No mental or psychopharmacological disorders excluded. Involuntary treatment under the Mental Health Act as clinically required. There's a big fuss being made about this, but we currently have 2,000 beds in the province where somebody can be held under the Mental Health Act as an involuntary patient. Anybody who's worked with people with severe mental illness and addictions, and especially the family members, say, yes, there's a time when I need my relative in voluntary treatment, otherwise it won't happen, especially with things like bipolar disorder. So that's what he has in mind. Let's see what else we've got. I think that's about it. Just as kind of a summary of what I've just been talking about, the ideology and stereotyping of Riverview rather than evidence-based practices has been the problem. The lack of understanding of Riverview's role, and what I've been saying here about the tertiary role versus the long-term residential role. The program that ran in the Center Line program with the acute treatment unit, that's what really caused the major problem when that was closed. And I know because we couldn't get people in after that. And actually the admissions closed much earlier than the actual hospital closed. I can remember trying to get patients into Riverview 7 or 8 years before that. This is hammering on this one, but the big problem, frankly, is we had non-clinical, inexperienced, and incapable decision makers and policy makers. In other words, they didn't know what they were doing, and they got caught up on the deinstitutionalization bandwagon. The other problem,
They were government employees?
government employees and this succession of administrators they brought in who didn't know anything, basically. So, yeah.
Just how does Riverview become a cash cow? I don't get it.
It never was.
Cash cow.
Well, they thought it was, they're seeing Riverview as a cash cow. They thought it was a cash cow. That's how it was actually sold. I'm not going to point fingers, but actually the
They
final.
sold it for cash.
No, they didn't. But they convinced the bureaucracy that if they close it, there would be all sorts of money liberated.
Oh, I see.
The money was never liberated. No, there's no trace of whatever happened to the money. Yeah. Okay, so meanwhile, Riverview's abandoned buildings and largely vacant site are still there. It's managed by BC Housing, and I put managed in quotation marks because they're not managing at all. And again, what I think is so disturbing, this is such a major asset that belongs to the people of BC. Do you know that even the BC Horticultural Society, which had the tours of trees on plants on the grounds, they can't do that anymore because they've been told to, they have to get a huge insurance policy to go on.
It's over 1,000 now.
Over 1,000 just to do a volunteer tour of the grounds. One of my colleagues, former Riverview psychiatrist, threw a picnic there last year, and he rented the parking lot at Penn Hall for the picnic. They wouldn't provide any access to buildings or toilets or anything like that. And he was charged $2,200 to rent the parking lot for a picnic. So I could go on. Anyhow, that's the end of that sad story. So thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Well, my name is Ken Petterson, and I knew Mary. I'd like to give you a little update of how things were at that time. We've seen a lot of history here well, particularly of Essendale. I used to come out past here along the Dudney Trunk Road, I think it was by there. We had a summer home on Pipeline Road by where the Allard Gravel, I think it's called, Pipeline Road. We had 10 acres. We paid $100 an acre. Can you imagine that? That was in 1948. $100 an acre. Came up here by steam train. Steam train stopped on Shaughnessy. And then we'd get somebody to drive us out. And the other thing, Anna, you didn't tell us about, it may just be me, but I saw no pictures of the Wild Duck Inn.
I'm so sorry, because half the hospital had to get together.
Because that very much seemed to be a part of nursing and getting back.
Really, I guess at times it did. Yes.
So I started in BC Penn. I was doing my doctorate at UBC and had finished the coursework, and there was an ad in the UBC newspaper. It said, if you want to work as an intern for the Canadian government over the summer, we'll find you a summer job. There were lots of jobs in those days. And so I took one. I wanted to go into oceanography because my grandfather was captain of the boat for the Hastings Mill. So we're sort of pioneer family going back. They said, I got a call and they said, would you like to work in the penitentiary? Would you like to teach in the penitentiary? I thought, no, I don't want to teach in the penitentiary. I don't know where the penitentiary is, and I don't want anything to do with it. But then I thought to myself, I'm almost too smart by half. Well, I'll have to go along to the interview, and there'll be a lot of people, and I won't make it, and there'll be another offer that comes up. So I went to the interview. I was the last person. They said, wait, we'll give you the results. The other, we have to send it out by mail. They said, you got the job. And I thought maybe, well, I weighed 250 pounds, and I was doing judo at the time, and that probably gives me a good stand. So that's how I ended up there. But it's very important to understand the penitentiary, which came in 1878. The two buildings, you know, Essendale and that just sort of grew up, although one was over there on Columbia. I give you some facts and figures here. In 1960, 20% of the inmates got out on parole. 69, 50%, and 72, 65%. So we're talking about 75. I can't tell you what it is today. But the parole board never used to have face-to-face hearings. They'd just write it up and send it to Ottawa. They'd make it, 5 of them would sit there and make a decision, send the decision back. So it wasn't until 1969 they had the first hearings where the offender would appear before the board and be able to speak. Before that, nothing. So the years in which the 70s were a tough time. They were a time of change, a time of a little faster moving change. If you think about them, and if you were alive then, it was a time when we had incidents at the BC Pen, we kept the phone line open and the teletype. Chugga, 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 the teletype open to keep in contact with Ottawa. The warden's secretary had the best typewriter. It was a IBM Selectronic or whatever it is. It had a little ball that went flying around. Only there was no Xerox. Carbon paper was a good business at that time then, and they do their skinnies or whatever you call those things that you, flimsies. So times were different. I think, you know, today when I reach in my pocket, I can talk to anybody in the world for nothing, and I can look at them at the same time. I don't need to take a newspaper. The world is so changed. The automobiles are now electric, or they will soon, you know, the greatest proportion will soon be electric. Things are changing. They're moving faster and faster and faster. And Doctor, I'm sure you're up on whatever is happening now with this brain-computer interface. You know, things are moving very, very fast, and with artificial intelligence. But then, it was a different time. It was a different time. There were newspapers. You know, people would have newspapers. That was the way you found your information. All your information, you paid to get information basically that was a day old. And home delivered, yeah. Home delivery now is, I think, $57 a month. In BC Pen, things were changing. Now, what happened? The Second World War finished. You had a lot of soldiers who needed jobs. And so the government of Canada provided jobs wherever they could, or gave them preference, which meant you come to the penitentiary, or the post office, I think, was another one. There were several areas anyway. So what happened in British Columbia Penitentiary, most of the people, not most, a good number, at least half the people working there, were ex-military. And so they were disciplined. And that way they came from the Westminster Regiment or the Masons. Those were the two groups, the Westminster Regiment and the Masons. So it had been like that for 7, 8, 9 years when we come along to where we are. The thing we're looking at today, it was about to change. And then a bunch of things changed in the society. Things happened that nobody has any control over. It's just called progress. For example, Loomis Armored Car Service came to Canada. And one of our middle-level officers went to work with them. The pay was much better. And he went over, when he went over there, he was at the middle management level. He took 4 other people over. And there were only about 9 of them or 10 of them at that rank. So it decimated the ranks. So now you had middle management being cut out. There just weren't the people. And bus service started in Surrey. And the people who worked on the buses, the drivers, got much better pay than you did working in the prison. So some of the people from corrections went over, and then they told their buddies, well, come on over. So a lot of people left for that. So they went to Loomis Armored Car Service. They went to the bus service. And that meant they had to hire new people. But what's happening at the time is your history is disappearing. It's going out the door. It's going out the door. So at the time, we're talking about with Mary, there were 1974 staff turnover 40%. And you'll see in corrections, correctional officers, the turnover was 62%. 62% of the guards turned over in 1 year. The case classification officers, there were 16 of them, and Mary was one, and 10 of them were new. So everything is just flipping over and flipping over and flipping over so quickly. The history is gone, and it's getting very touchy. People don't know what to do. Plus the fact that the military was organized and disciplined. At least those people had been through discipline and understood it and why. And the new people who were coming in weren't coming in from the military, they were coming in from the street. So they didn't have that military training. And so working as a team and that just wasn't as much. In 1972, when I went there, I met a girl. Her picture was in the pictures that you were showing, Anna. There's Irene and some of the people.
I saw myself in one of those pictures. And some of my colleagues.
So the situation was difficult. It was moving pretty fast. The street was moving pretty fast. The 70s came out of the 60s, and the 60s was a lot of drug use, that sort of thing. I lived in San Francisco in the 60s, and they say that if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. You know? So, I mean, I was there, and I'm still there. And I ended up in prison, too. But if I go to, we're talking here about this incident where Mary was shot on the 9th to the 11th of June. Well, on the Friday, the 9th was a Monday, on the Friday, the warden of the institution and I met with Mary. Mary asked me, would I stay behind and could we go up and talk to, his name was Dragon Cernetic, could we go and talk to Dragon because I want to see if I can get to university. She'd already finished her master's degree in that, so she wanted to do her doctorate. And she was more than capable of doing it. She had worked with the research, a fellow Murphy, Brian, I can't recall his first name. Anyway, she'd worked with research when she was at university, I believe, and knew about corrections. And she wanted to talk about why she wanted to get her doctorate and what her career plans were. So we met at 4 o'clock in the Dragon's office when business sort of shut for us at 4 o'clock so we could spend some time talking. And Mary was telling us about what she wanted to do. And she wanted to get ahead, and she wanted our support for that. At the time I was assistant warden there, but they also had another job that they appointed someone as deputy warden. And so we were the two people, I guess, who made the decision. And we said we'd support her. And so we talked, and she was excited. And she went away because with our, excuse me, at that time, if you had the support of the warden, and particularly at BC Penn, it was easier to move ahead and we would find the money, or the organization would find the money to do that. So Mary went home high on that Friday night about 5:15. And I went to work on Monday morning, and everything just shut down right immediately as the hostage situation began. I think that I think the reason Mary was very successful is that Mary knew that if you want a person to behave as a person, you treat them personally. I think she understood that very, very well. And so that paid off. She did very well with that. Now, what I'd like to do, we can talk a little about the hostage taking. If there's anything you want to know, I can tell you whatever I know. But there's one other thing that I should mention to you. There was a fellow in the States, I think in California, Glenn, you could probably tell me, Robert Martinson.
Right.
And I think he wrote a book called Nothing Works.
Yes.
And that was printed around, I believe, 1974. And so what happened was, because this thing said nothing works, remember with the newspaper, it leads if it bleeds.
Yeah.
Okay, if there's something that doesn't work, let's see what doesn't work about corrections. Because the thing about corrections is everybody's an expert. Everybody, you can go down the bar or down the street and people will have a view on corrections. They won't talk about anything else, but they'll all have a view on corrections, one way or the other. And you mentioned the orange man down in the States. Yeah, which this is what it's all about. This is what it's all about. Now, in the correctional service, we were taught that people come to prison as punishment, not for punishment. But we had a number of people who believe people came for punishment. And so even within the staff, there's a pull both ways. There's a pull both ways. There's one thing and then give the floor to my wife. I've so rarely had the floor over our 54 years of marriage. But this is something written by Judge Dennis Shaleen in the States. So what do you want from corrections? Okay? We want them to have self-worth. So we destroy their self-worth. We want them to be responsible, so we take away all responsibility. We want them to be part of the community, so we isolate them from the community. We want them to be positive and constructive, so we degrade and make them less than useless. We want them to be trustworthy, so we put no trust in them whatsoever. We want them to be nonviolent, so we put them where there's lots of violence around them. We want them to be kind and loving people, so we subject them to hatred and cruelty. We want them to quit being the tough guy, and we put them in a place where the tough guy rules. We want them to quit hanging around with losers, so of course we put them all under one roof. We want them to quit exploiting us, so we put them where they exploit each other. We want them to take control of their lives and own their problems and quit being a parasite, so we make them totally dependent on us. That actually is the arguments, goes both ways. Goes both ways. And so, you know, my thought on the matter is, as long as it's like that, it's just going to go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I remember, I think it was Dr. 1992, when Barrett became the thing. Most people voting at that time, as I recall, were voting because we were going to get car insurance. It wasn't about mental health, or you know, it was about, we will get cheaper car insurance if we go with a you know, out of private insurance. That was the issue. You know, there's paying no attention to mental health, but for prisons, attention. It's on the, you know, watch the news, go to the movies, or just see the movies that are advertised. Violence. So it's a real problem, and I certainly don't have any answer. But I will tell you one thing. Now, my friend Glenn Brown has read a lot more than I have. He'd even read the act and the directives, the commissioner's directives, the regional directives. You pile all these books up, and you maybe get this high. I used to be 6'4". I'm 6'2" now. I don't know what happened. I'll have disappeared entirely by 2305. Go through all those books. Find the word love once. Have you ever recalled finding the word love in any of the?
Unless it was in the French.
Yeah, it's not there. Yet we know that is what the solution is. That is what the solution is. You know, how we translate it is so difficult. Is so difficult because your record says this is everything you did bad. It doesn't say too much about what you did good. And so if we keep focusing on that, we don't go anywhere. Now, Irene and I have worked in or contracted and done some trauma training with some people, a number of offenders. We ask the question, what is it you want most in life? What is it you want most in life? Universally, the answer is love. Peace, calm. Was there anything else that comes in?
Purpose.
And purpose. So we know what's wanted, but how we deliver that, that's the problem. That's the question. And we have spent, I think when I started, it was about $1.1 billion to run corrections. And it's now, I think, about $3.1 or $3.2 billion for corrections. Yet there aren't that many more people in corrections. There are 1,500 more correctional officers than there used to be. So it gets more and more expensive. It gets bigger and bigger. And yeah, and the other thing is, of course, is, as Irene will tell you, that a good number of the people in prison are people who have real mental problems. A dual diagnosis, it's just incredible. So with that, I'll turn that over to you, darling. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was... Okay, you stand. I followed instructions.
Well, what Ken didn't tell you, it took him 27 years to get paroled. He came into BC Penn as a teacher in May of 1972, and I came in within weeks of that as a classification officer. So that's where we met. So good things can happen in prison. Ken's been retired for 25 years. He retired as a warden, but he actually started as a school teacher and brought the GED program to the prison system. And a lot of inmates ended up, when they were released, with their grade 12, because that became a rule. You had to go to school if you didn't have grade 12. So instead of going to the carpentry shop or the different shops they had, you went to the school. And in spite of all the things the public know about or think they know about the prison system, Ken was locked in a classroom and had no keys to get out. He was locked in there with all the offenders. And there were all kinds of lifers. They'd killed people.
Andy Bruce was one of them.
And he's still here today. He never had any problems. He didn't have any problems. So Mary and I have a very similar background. She was 6 months ahead of me in nursing out at Riverview, so her class graduated 6 months before mine. We both went to SFU, and my degree was in political science. And then she went to UBC long before I did, but we both have master's degrees in social work. My path was a little bit different. I was a head nurse at Woodlands. I worked at Woodlands for 10 years. And I asked to be demoted. And they looked at me. I said, no, I want to be demoted. I'd like to work night shift and go to school. And they wouldn't let me, so I resigned after 10 years. And I got a job at in those days, the Narcotic Addictions Foundation in Vancouver. And I worked on the downtown east side, and I worked with lots of substance abusers, obviously, and worked my way through university. And it was surprising how many nurses were at university wanting to leave nursing. And we'd all meet, and we were doing our education. So when I finished, I decided I was going to go and work in a prison, and BC Penn had an opening. My first day on the job, the Solicitor General was there and all kinds of government officials because there'd been a hostage taking. And a woman had been taken hostage. She was not harmed, and she was released in a short period of time. The officer at the front gate said to me, if you get taken hostage, don't expect me to save you. And I said, hey, that's fine. I just came from the downtown east side. Thank you very much. I'll look after myself. That's how I started. It was a very antagonistic relationship. I was the third woman in Canada to work in a maximum security prison, so you can imagine how welcomed I was. Probably Mary was the fourth. I don't know, Margaret, if there was anybody back east. So if not, Mary would have been the fourth woman in Canada to work in a maximum security prison. So I started the year before her. I guess if I look at Mary's history and my history, we were cultural breakers. We were cultural breakers. We were a threat to the existing system that was male-dominated, and Ken already covered that, by mostly military people. And we were a threat in a number of ways, but I think safety. For somehow they thought if you're a woman, you couldn't do the job or you wouldn't be safe in there. We were safer than the officers. We were safer. I wasn't going to tell this, but it's just popped in my mind. I was in my office and a guy came down to see me, and as soon as he came in, I saw he was high on drugs. I knew him well, and he did this, and I was backed against the wall. And I looked at him. I won't use his name, but I called him by his first name, and I said, you know what? See that guard up there in the tower? In those days, the towers were all armed. I said, if that officer looks over here and sees what's going on, we both might be killed, and I don't know if he's a very good shot. So get the hell out of here right now. And he turned and left.
Good thinking.
And I went and told the warden, and of course he got charged and went up to segregation for 30 days. It was a bit of common sense. And I had many of those experiences on the downtown east side before I got to the penitentiary. I'd had a gun to my head, a knife. Luckily there are no bullets in the gun, I found out later. And I just talked quietly and softly. Having been on a police team with Vancouver Police for over a year and going out on calls with them, calm is the order of the day. Calmness can get you through just about anything. There was not calm the day that Mary was shot. There was not calm. So we were a threat in a lot of ways when we were in the prison system. And many colleagues were often telling me to stop working so hard. That's before Mary came. The same theme continued because I was making them look bad. Look bad. Because I had 150 inmates on my caseload when I started there. And I thought, how am I going to connect with these people? So I thought, okay, I'm going to phone all the shops every morning. And I'm going to say, at 9 I'll be at this shop, at 10 I'll be at this shop. And I would go into the shops where they were doing industrial work, like sewing mail bags for the post office, whatever they were doing. And the officer would know I'm coming up, and I'd say, okay, who needs to talk? Who's got some issues? And I would go in the officer's office. I started 2 groups. One was called the Community Awareness Group, and the other was called the Drug Study Group. And those were ways to have contact with a lot of people. And Dragan Cernetic, who was the warden at the time, was very supportive of anything that I was trying to do. And when Mary came in the fall of '73 and I started in May '72, I said to her, why don't you take one of the groups? So she took the community awareness group and I did the drug study group. We'd be in a boardroom at the end of that building where the hostage occurred, in a big boardroom, and we could have 20, 25 or more inmates. And we were in there alone with them for a couple hours doing a group. There were no guards in there. There was nobody guarding us. And we had some amazing conversations. It went really well. So I think Dragon was pretty happy about some of the things that we were doing. Mary was such a welcoming sight when she arrived. Prior to her arrival, I experienced a riot. I looked out the window one day and I could see the smoke and the fire, and a riot had occurred. And the warden came at that time. It was before Dragon. It was Graves was the warden. This was Friday, and he said, I need you to come to work Saturday. You need to sit and go through all the files. I need to know what offenders are from the East Coast. So we had 75 people chosen, and they were shipped out. Some of the pictures here, you can see the rubble. Do you see this big circle here? That's a cell wall. When they tore off the sinks, they were battering rams as they went down the tiers, smashing it all wide open. So what had to happen is we had to get people out in another facility so the place could be reconstructed. I was pretty shocked when I saw some of that going on, but hey, we were so busy going through files and getting things organized. We got through it. So Mary arrived. She was a team player, she was a great support, and we knew of each other previously. But we didn't have a close connection really until we were in the prison system together. And that's when we did all our work.
I should just say this, there were 73 that were shipped out.
Oh.
They were just about, most of them were all shipped back because it hadn't been done in a sort of legal way. And so, you know, plane was chartered, they were all moved back, and then they came back again.
This is a correctional magazine. And you'll see there are 6 women. That was me in those days. So Mary had died in that hostage in June. And in this September article that came out, Women in Corrections, Reality is Now. They were desperately looking to get more and more women in corrections. There were no female officers, but then there weren't female police officers either. But it was all men. So male offenders and male inmates.
I had one of the first female officers at Kent. What was her name now, Irene? Carol Ann.
Oh yes, Carolyn, yeah.
Carol Ann was one of the first female officers.
She was 19 when she started. She ended up being the warden at Matsqui for a number of years, and she's currently a member of the Federal Parole Board, and she's probably one of the best parole board members because she worked in the prison system for years, and she was a warden. And she says it like it is, and all the guys love it when she's the person that they have to appear in front of. Because they talk. They have a conversation. So after working at BC Penn for just over 2 years, I was offered a position in Vancouver Parole, and I accepted it. I accepted it because I was sick and tired of a lot of the staff, not the inmates. The inmates weren't a problem. And I guess I found my voice, and I was becoming very outspoken and fighting back. And I just thought, I'm not doing this anymore. So I took the position at Vancouver Parole, little to know that they were assigning me to BC Penn. Assigning me to BC Penn. Because parole officers are assigned to different institutions. So that was where I worked, at a BC Pen. So I would go in and interview guys that were coming out into the community, either at the end of their sentence or if they were being paroled. And I would be supervising them in the community. And the supervision we did in those days is very different than today. I would go to the downtown east side. I would go down there looking for guys and talking to them, or they would come to my office.
We used to call them patrol officers, not parole officers. Because if you were in the basement of the pub or whatever it is, you know who'd come walking through. So that was our dating life, actually.
So I still interacted with Mary. Mary took over the groups that I did, which was very appreciative. And we maintained regular contact. Then, both Mary and I were chosen by the government to work on the Federal Corrections Agency Task Force. And in simple language, that was going to be the marriage of the Canadian Penitentiary Service and the Parole Service. They were going to become one. So Mary and I worked on that committee for several years. We still did our regular job, but we worked on that committee. We went back and forth to Ottawa attending meetings. We were out in the community interviewing people. The role was, that we had was to assist with the redesign and development of corrections. There were about 20 of us on that committee, and we went to all different regions across the country. And then in 1979, the planning and the amalgamation was completed, and the Penitentiary Service was renamed Corrections Service Canada. So on the morning of June the 11th, the day of the hostage, as a parole officer, I was on my way to the prison. And I got a call. And I was told there was a hostage. Don't go. Go back. And of course I knew very quickly what it was all about and who the hostages were. And those were all my colleagues. Those were all the people I worked with at the prison before I changed over to the parole service. And of course, Ken and I were dating, and he was inside there. So he was the assistant warden at the time. That hostage lasted till Wednesday around midnight when Mary was shot. The next day, I went down to the Royal Columbian Hospital because I knew that's where the morgue was, and that's where Mary's body would be. I was so distraught, and I happened to be fortunate enough to know Doug Jack very well, who was the coroner. And he was also a former police officer. And I sat down with him, and I said, please, just tell me what happened. And he told me. And he told me Mary took a bullet to her heart and died instantly. It was pretty shocking. It was pretty shocking to hear that. I think I walked around in a daze, in a dream world for a while, just trying to figure out what the hell happened. "15 staff had been taken hostage. One of them was released. He was an older gentleman, and he had a heart condition. And the hostage takers, there were 3 of them, they released him. The 3 inmates that took the hostages were Claire Wilson, Andy Bruce, and Dwight Lucas. All 3 I knew. I don't know whatever happened to Claire. I don't know where he is, if he's alive. Andy Bruce died 2 years ago. But we only hear bad things. I want you to hear some good things. When he was back east in prison, there was a hostage taking in Ontario, and a nurse was taken hostage. And the administration went to Andy and said, help us. He got her out unharmed, and there was no incident. That was never put on his file. That was never talked about, ever. Andy came from a family of 13. He was the only bad guy. All his siblings were successful. His sister is a social worker on the downtown east side. But there's things about Andy that I think a lot of people didn't know. He was hurt as a child. He was abused. So when he got out of BC Penn eventually, well, it wasn't BC Penn, he'd been transferred, and he actually was released on parole at a mission institution where Ken was the warden, but not at the time he was released. He went to the downtown east side and he got a job. And I used to go down there and talk to him all the time. He worked with Indigenous youth on the downtown east side. I went to some of the meetings that he was running. He was teaching youth to make drums. He was talking to them about prison. And he was doing a lot of prevention work. That is probably, I've never seen it written or said anywhere, what he did. He was doing good work. I used to talk to him a lot and see him at the halfway house where he lived, and I could see more and more he was deteriorating. He'd had a stroke, he'd had a heart attack, and eventually dementia set in. And so the last couple of years of his life, he was in a nursing home. And so he died about 2 years ago. Dwight Lucas got out, and he never returned to prison. I don't know the exact numbers, but I'd say it's 25 to 30 years that he's been out. He lives in Toronto. He's been the manager of a high-end men's clothing store for years. But we don't talk about those things. We don't talk about the good that people do. We only talk about the bad things they do. And let me tell you, I'm 84 now and I'm still working. And when I meet up with different groups and different people, I have to be quiet and mutter under my breath. The wrong people are too often in prison. I see people out there, and I don't know why the hell they're not locked up. Because they're not doing much good, and they're doing dangerous things. And if you see in the newspaper every day how many times some of these people are in and out constantly, and harming people, killing people. So, just like John, I so appreciated the things you said about Riverview. I didn't know as much as you enlightened us about today. And see the failure of mental health, the failure of our justice system. But I could go on a rant forever about these things. So I've decided that we can do no great things, only small things with great love. That's a direct quote from Mother Teresa, who has been my hero since I was about 12. And so we just do small things. That's all we can do. And I still am doing work in corrections, but I'm not an employee of corrections. I get phone calls all the time. I just got one the other day. Can I come in? Can I do this? Can I do that? Well, We didn't go into the institutions during COVID. None of us did. We weren't allowed. But occasionally we can, and I will go because staff have asked me. And some pretty horrific situations of trauma. Trauma is my specialty. I've been in private practice for 40 years, and that's my passion, to deal with trauma. I do a lot of trauma work with first responders, and I do some in the institutions, and I've been under contract with the federal government to go up to Coquitlam, the healing village, which is out near Harrison, and it has a capacity for 50 people, and they're all Indigenous, and many of them have been in residential schools, and it takes 20 years or more to get up there, because most of the people that are up there are lifers, and you have to work your way through the system. But the power of some of the work, and Ken comes with me. I was doing it on my own for a while, and then I thought, no, I think it's better to have a male and a female. So we do it together, and he's a wonderful male role model, and all these men know him anyway. And one of the things he did recently, I had a young fellow who was not a lifer, one of the few non-lifers up there, and he said, I'd like to role play with Ken. I thought, great. I'm trying to get these guys to go deeper and deeper. So he wrote a script for Ken to play his father. And he played himself. Now the question always is, where did we learn to do life? You know what the answer is. Look at the people that are mentally ill. Look at the people on the downtown east side, and then ask yourself that question. And then we might have some empathy for some of those people. So this young man sat in front of Ken in a dyad, and the men in the group were here, and I went and stood back. And I said, I want you to let Ken know what it was like growing up in your home as a child. And he started speaking, and he didn't speak for very long, and he burst into tears. And I just went and stood beside him and put my arm around his shoulders. And I said, just talk through your tears. I looked around the room, and as he was speaking to Ken as his father, all these hardcore killers were crying. Crying. Would have been good to have a video and show it to the court system. They were crying. And then doing this and trying to be big hard-ass guys like they always are. And I've been trying to teach them for years. Real men cry. It was beautiful. And the best thing of all is in those days, the old days, it was classification officer, but today in corrections, it's your institutional parole officer. So like a case manager. She had asked if she could sit in on one of the groups. Well, we don't let people come in. And I said, well, don't ask me. Ask the men, it's their group. So they said, yes, she could come. Because many of them had her as a caseworker. She could hardly hold her tears back because the guy that was crying and talking to Ken was on her caseload. And she saw him in a way she'd never seen him before. And so when we were in the Longhouse having a ceremony, he stood up and he said, when I was in the trauma group and did a role play, my heart changed. my heart changed. So, in spite of all the negativity, it's like we can do no great things, just those little things with great love. And you can get results. That's where Mary was coming from. I know that. That's where she was coming from her heart, and for the little things we could do each day. So I'm going to leave it with that, because if I don't shut up, I could go on forever. There's so much to tell, and I like people to know the real truth about the things inside, like inside Riverview, inside the prisons. One last thing that just popped into my mind, I had people say to me, aren't you scared going to work there? Isn't that an awful place to be? When I was at BC Penn, I said, I feel safer in BC Penn than I do in my own community. And people just looked at me like I was crazy. And now think about it today on the downtown, not the downtown east side so much, but just anywhere. Starbucks downtown Vancouver. Watch your news every night. Listen to the spokesperson from Vancouver Police. How many people are being attacked and not safe? I never feel unsafe in prison, ever. Thank you.
That was fabulous.
Do you know what? Can I just share this?
Yeah.
I've got all this stuff here, different, the drug study group, a folder of different magazines that wrote stories about this group. This group of federal inmates at BC Penn were in Maclean's magazine, the Psych Nurses Journal. I got them to write about them. We got Gary Bannerman from CKNW to come into the prison. Dragon was the warden, and he gave them permission to come in, and the drug study group went on air live.
It was for about 2 hours.
I want to share this letter that Gary Bannerman wrote. He wrote it to the secretary of the drug study group, who was a federal inmate. He says, Dear Dawn, the broadcast from the penitentiary with your group was one of the most satisfying I've ever done in many months, and to date, the reaction has been overwhelmingly positive, not necessarily agreeing with your points of view, but agreeing that you have a right to be listened to. That in itself is an important breakthrough. I suggest you keep plugging. I'll be seeing you again before much time goes by. Gary Banner.
Great.
Well, thank you so much. You have captivated this group, I think. Absolutely captivated.
Yeah.
With your delivery and the real truth and wisdom that come through. So can't thank you enough. And maybe you'll come back one day and do it again. Or
Well,
do it for another group.
I think it's important in Mary's memory, and that's why we're here today, to remember that's what she was all about. And she worked hard to get that to happen in the system. And had she not died, she probably would be running corrections. That would have been a good thing.
Yeah.
The city of Coquitlam is really proud of events like this. The city of Coquitlam has been the host community for the largest mental health facilities in the province for 100 years, before I was born. And it truly is amazing when I see a room full of people that want to understand and want to grasp the realities of the street disorder and the challenges. My daughter did speak at events here in this room because of her own mental health issues. She was very public with her mental illness starting in 2014 and multiple incarcerations, I guess, or institutionalizations. And she's at home today, and she wanted me to comment about how important it is to contemplate the criminality and the mental health and the things that we can do to try to understand a little bit better. The City of Coquitlam actually hired Dr. John Higinbottam to do what I think is still an amazing report about what we could do at Riverview. Not so much reopen, but repurpose. And let's do it the way we would do it today in state-of-the-art facilities and state-of-the-art treatments. Because our challenges on the street aren't just where do we store the people, how do we treat the people? How do we help the people? And that has been something that so many of you have believed in. As part of this, as a child, our doctor was in Westminster. I remember those days when the military was parked on the front lawn of the BC Penitentiary because of the hostage crisis, and I remember the tragedy. So not enough, and I'm so pleased that you're able to share that in such a positive way, looking forward to the future that could be better if we all understand what the past was, rather than everybody being an expert. So on behalf of the City of Coquitlam, sorry I was too long-winded, and on behalf of my daughter, who is now a psychiatric nurse with a master's in clinical counseling, treatment works, and treatment helped my daughter, and treatment can help so many, and I think the focus today is punishment too often and treatment hardly ever. So thank you.